Picture this: a world where entire cities fall silent, streets littered with the dead, and the air thick with the stench of decay. In just a few years, the Black Death wiped out nearly half of Europe's population, leaving behind a trail of fear and devastation so profound it reshaped history itself. We've all heard the stories: rats, fleas, and the Grim Reaper's relentless march. But what if I told you there's more to this nightmare than meets the eye? What if the truths buried beneath 6 centuries of dust and dread could rewrite everything we thought we knew? For generations, the Black Death has been wrapped in myths and half-truths, a shadowy monster lurking in our history books. But today, we're pulling back that curtain. This isn't just a tale of tragedy, it's a puzzle waiting to be solved. Why did some towns escape unscathed while others vanished overnight? Were rats really the villains, or has history pointed the finger at the wrong culprit? And what secrets lie hidden in the bones of those who lived and died through the darkest days of humanity? The answers might shock you. So buckle up, because we're diving deep into the hidden truths behind one of history's most infamous catastrophes. From long-buried evidence to startling modern discoveries, we'll unravel the mysteries that historians are still debating today. This isn't just a story about the past, it's a warning, a revelation, and a testament to human resilience. By the time we're done, you'll see the Black Death in a whole new light and question what else history might have gotten wrong, ready to uncover the secrets. Let's begin. For over a century, we've been told one simple story: the Black Death spread because of rats, those filthy, flea-infested rodents scurrying through medieval streets, supposedly turned Europe into a breeding ground for plague. But here's the problem: that story doesn't always add up. Recent discoveries are tearing holes in this age-old theory, forcing historians and scientists to rethink everything. Take the case of Iceland, an island with virtually no rats during the Middle Ages, yet the Black Death still ravaged its population, killing nearly half the people in some regions. If rats were the key culprits, how did the plague reach places they didn't? And why did some cities with dense rat populations suffer less than others? The inconsistencies keep piling up. Now, cutting-edge research is pointing to a far more unsettling possibility. Humans might have been the real super spreaders. Genetic studies of ancient plague victims reveal traces of the bacteria in human lice and fleas, suggesting the disease could jump directly from person to person like a medieval version of the flu. Others argue that livestock, like goats and sheep, may have carried infected fleas into homes, bypassing rats altogether. Even the speed of the plague spread hints at something more complex than a rat-borne epidemic. The Black Death moved at an astonishing pace, faster than rats typically travel. Some records describe entire villages wiped out in days, a timeline that aligns more closely with airborne transmission or rapid human-to-human contact than a slow rodent migration. So why did the rat myth stick for so long? Blame early 20th century scientists who first linked the plague to rodents based on outbreaks in India. Their theory became textbook truth, even when evidence suggested otherwise. But as we dig deeper, literally unearthing centuries-old skeletons and analyzing DNA, we're finding that nature's deadliest killers rarely follow simple rules. The Black Death wasn't just one monster, it was an entire nightmare ecosystem working in horrifying harmony, and that realization changes everything. The story of the Black Death doesn't start in Europe's crowded cities or flea-infested alleyways. It begins thousands of miles away in the vast steppes of Central Asia. Deep in the foothills of the Tian Shan Mountains, where ancient trade routes crisscrossed like veins, something deadly was stirring. For decades, historians have debated the plague's true ground zero. Was it China's bustling ports where merchant ships carried more than just silk and spices? Or was it the remote grasslands of modern-day Kyrgyzstan, where excavations of 14th century graves reveal tombstones etched with chilling words? died of pestilence? The answer might lie in both. Trade was the lifeblood of the medieval world, and the Silk Road was its beating heart. But with every caravan of spices and silver came invisible passengers, fleas clinging to fur, rats stowed in grain sacks, and a bacteria called Yersinia pestis waiting for its moment. By the 1330s, the plague had already begun its quiet creep westward, hopping from oasis towns to bustling markets. Then came the event that turned a slow burn into an inferno, the Siege of Kaffa. In 1346, a Mongol army surrounded the Genos trading post of Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia in Crimea, trapping terrified merchants inside its walls. What happened next reads like a scene from a horror story. According to an eyewitness, the Mongol commander ordered corpses of plague victims catapulted over the city walls, deliberately weaponizing the disease. Whether this was history's first act of biological warfare or just a gruesome legend, the outcome was undeniable. Fleeing Genos ships carried the plague to Constantinople, then Sicily, and within months the nightmare reached Europe's shores. But here's the twist. The siege might not have been the spark, just the accelerant. Recent genetic research suggests multiple plague strains were already circulating in Europe before Kaffa, possibly arriving through quieter, less dramatic routes. Some scholars argue infected marmot pelts traded from Siberia played a role, while others point to Baltic amber traders or even pilgrim routes to Mecca. The truth is messier than any single villain, a perfect storm of climate change, collapsing ecosystems, and a globalized medieval economy hurtling toward disaster. So why does this matter today? Because the Black Death wasn't just a medieval tragedy, it's a blueprint. The same forces that drove its spread, global trade, ecological disruption, human conflict, still shape pandemics now. And as we sift through the bones and ledgers of the past, we're not just solving a 700-year-old mystery. We're learning how to read the warnings written in history's scars. Among the most chilling revelations about the Black Death is this: some people may have walked among the sick, untouched by symptoms, all while spreading death invisibly. Modern science calls them asymptomatic carriers, but medieval Europe had no such concept, only the terror of watching some households perish while others miraculously stood firm. Today, we understand that pandemics don't play fair. Just as COVID-19 showed us silent spreaders, the plague likely had its own shadow agents, individuals who carried Yersinia pestis without ever collapsing into fever or agony. Genetic studies of ancient DNA reveal a startling clue. Certain populations in Europe had higher survival rates, not because of luck, but because of inherited resistance. In one groundbreaking study, researchers analyzing skeletons from plague pits found gene mutations, like the ARAP2 variant, that helped some immune systems recognize and fight the bacteria. These genetic survivors didn't just live, they may have unknowingly become vectors, passing the plague to others even as their own bodies resisted its worst effects. Take the case of Iam, a small English village that famously quarantined itself during an outbreak in 1666. Records show that while entire families died, a handful of residents never fell ill. Were they immune or merely silent carriers? The same question haunts modern outbreaks. During the 2014 Ebola epidemic, researchers discovered asymptomatic cases spreading the virus, proof that history's deadliest diseases often hide in plain sight. But here's where the Black Death gets even stranger. Unlike modern illnesses where asymptomatic spread is subtle, the plague's silent carriers might have included an unexpected group: children. Medieval accounts describe villages where adults died in droves while children showed mild or no symptoms. Some scientists theorize that young immune systems, still developing, reacted differently to the bacteria, leaving kids as potential walking reservoirs of the disease. Imagine a toddler playing in the streets, unknowingly delivering fleas or contaminated droplets to grieving neighbors. The parallels to today are impossible to ignore. From typhoid Mary in the early 20th century to asymptomatic COVID carriers, the nightmare of invisible spread is a thread woven through pandemic history. Yet the Black Death adds a darker twist. Those who survived weren't always heroes. Some may have been the very reason the plague kept burning through towns and cities, their genetic luck becoming everyone else's curse. It's a reminder that in the war between humans and microbes, survival isn't just about who dies, it's about who lives and what they carry forward. The speed of the Black Death wasn't just terrifying, it defied logic. Imagine a disease so ruthless it could erase an entire village between sunrise and sunset, leaving behind only silence and smoke from funeral pyres. While modern pandemics unfold over months or years, the Great Mortality raced through 14th century Europe like wildfire, sometimes covering 50 miles in a single day. Eyewitness accounts describe towns where people went to bed healthy and never woke up, where gravediggers collapsed mid-burial, joining the corpses they just lowered into the ground. But how dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, has given us a startling clue. By analyzing growth patterns in ancient oaks and pines, scientists discovered Europe was suffering through a mini ice age in the 1340s. Bitter winters and soggy summers destroyed crops, leaving populations malnourished and vulnerable. But here's the twist: those same tree rings also reveal an eerie spike in rainfall just before major outbreaks. Damp conditions meant more fleas, more rodents, and perfect conditions for Yersinia pestis to thrive. The plague didn't just spread, it rode the weather like an invisible tide. One harrowing account from a monastery in Italy describes a traveling merchant who stopped for a meal, shared wine with the monks, and was dead by midnight. By dawn, half the monastery had succumbed. This wasn't the slow creep of rats, it was something far more efficient. Some historians now believe pneumonic plague, a lung-based version spread through coughs and breath, supercharged the Black Death spread in crowded spaces. A single marketplace, church service, or ship's hold could become a death trap in hours. Then there's the case of the village of Derbach in Germany. Church records show it had 600 souls in the spring of 1349. By autumn, only 3 families remained. Tree rings from the region show that summer was unusually warm, perfect for flea populations to explode. But the real horror lies in the logistics. How did the plague reach isolated villages so fast? The answer might lie in medieval pilgrimage routes. Every summer, thousands walked to holy sites, unknowingly carrying fleas in their clothing or luggage. Like sparks from a bonfire, they carried death into the heart of Europe's countryside. What makes this timeline so chilling isn't just the speed, it's the precision. By mapping outbreak dates against trade routes and weather patterns, researchers see a grim predictability. The plague didn't move randomly. It followed roads, rivers, and human footsteps with terrifying efficiency. And that's the real lesson of the Black Death. When nature, climate, and human behavior align just right, catastrophe doesn't walk, it runs. When we picture the Black Death, most of us imagine those horrific swollen lymph nodes, the buboes bursting under the skin like rotten fruit. But that was just one face of the plague's monstrous power. Medieval doctors recorded symptoms so bizarre, so gruesome, they sound like scenes from a nightmare. Patients coughing up blood-flecked foam before collapsing mid-sentence, others developing blackened fingers and toes as gangrene set in, their flesh literally rotting while they still breathed. Then there were the ones who went mad, screaming about phantom fires under their skin before death silenced them forever. The plague didn't just kill, it performed grotesque experiments on the human body. Take the pneumonic form, which ravaged the lungs like a demonic pneumonia. Unlike the slower bubonic version, this strain could kill within 24 hours, spreading through coughs and turning victims' sputum bloody pink. A Venetian physician described patients drowning in their own fluids, their chests making wet, crackling sounds with every labored breath. Even more terrifying was the septicemic plague, where the bacteria invaded the bloodstream directly. Skin turned purple with hemorrhages, tongues blackened, and death came so fast some didn't even develop buboes. One chronicle tells of a man who complained of chills at dawn and was buried by noon. The confusion these symptoms caused was deadly. Monks interpreting the blackened skin as God's marks often misdiagnosed septicemic cases as divine punishment, wasting precious hours on prayers instead of isolation. Meanwhile, pneumonic victims were mistaken for common pneumonia sufferers, allowed to wander markets and churches, exhaling death with every breath. Even the buboes were misunderstood. Some healers lanced them, not realizing the pus inside teemed with contagion. But perhaps the most haunting accounts come from those who recorded the psychological toll. A Florentine scribe wrote of victims experiencing vivid hallucinations, angels whispering to them, walls bleeding, invisible hands dragging them from their beds. Modern scientists now recognize these as signs of oxygen deprivation or brain inflammation, but to medieval witnesses, it seemed the plague didn't just destroy bodies, it stole souls before the final breath. What makes these details so crucial isn't just the shock value. It's the realization that the Black Death wasn't a single horror, but a shape-shifting array of terrors. A village might face the slow agony of buboes 1 month, then the lightning strike of pneumonic plague the next. This variability explains why some communities thought they'd survived the worst, only to be obliterated by a deadlier wave. It wasn't ignorance that doomed so many, it was the plague's cruel talent for disguising itself, leaving medieval healers fighting 100 different battles against an enemy they couldn't even name. Medieval Europe faced the Black Death with a desperation that bred some of history's most horrifying and absurd attempts at a cure. Imagine a physician slicing open your arm to drain corrupt blood, convinced the plague was caused by an imbalance of bodily humors. Bloodletting wasn't just common, it was doctrine endorsed by medical texts dating back to ancient Greece. But here's the tragic irony: weakening already starved patients often hastened their deaths. One account from Paris describes a nobleman who survived the initial fever only to bleed out under his doctor's knife, his body too exhausted to clot. Then there were the potions concoctions so bizarre they sound like witchcraft. Crushed emeralds, powdered unicorn horn, which was usually narwhal tusk, and drinks laced with mercury promised to purify the blood. Wealthy victims guzzled molten gold or ground-up sapphires, believing precious stones could counteract the disease's poison. A recipe from the University of Montpellier included viper's flesh, wine, and 24 herbs boiled until it resembled tar. Not only did these potions fail, many were outright lethal. Mercury poisoning caused kidney failure, and gold ingestion led to internal burns. The cure, in many cases, was deadlier than the plague itself. But no image is more iconic or misleading than the beaked plague doctor. Those haunting bird-like masks stuffed with aromatic herbs like camphor and cloves were meant to ward off miasma, the foul air thought to carry disease. The truth, those doctors were often second-rate physicians or even con artists paid by towns to appear during outbreaks. Their treatments, from rubbing onions on buboes to applying poultices of human feces, only spread infection further. Venetian records reveal one doctor who charged exorbitant fees before fleeing town, leaving his patients to die untreated. Perhaps the cruelest cure was the purge, forcing patients to vomit or empty their bowels relentlessly. Herbs like hellebore induced violent diarrhea, dehydrating victims already struggling with fever. A monk's diary from Avignon recounts a young girl who survived the plague's fever only to perish from exhaustion after 3 days of forced purging. Even religion turned deadly. Flagellants roamed the countryside, whipping themselves raw to atone for humanity's sins, unknowingly spreading plague-ridden fleas with every lash of their bloodied scourges. What makes these failed remedies so chilling isn't just their brutality, it's the logic behind them. Medieval medicine wasn't blind superstition. It was a system built on centuries of observation, just catastrophically wrong. When faced with an invisible killer, they fought with the only tools they understood. And that's the real tragedy. In their desperation to heal, they often handed the plague its next victim. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it slaughtered an entire economic system. Feudalism, the rigid medieval hierarchy that had ruled Europe for centuries, crumbled under the weight of mass death, leaving behind a world where peasants suddenly held power. Imagine a land where half the workforce vanishes overnight. Fields lay fallow, livestock roamed untended, and lords who once commanded obedience found themselves begging for laborers. This wasn't just a crisis, it was a revolution in disguise. Before the plague, serfs were bound to the land like property, owing back-breaking labor to their lords in exchange for meager protection. But with villages emptied, survivors discovered their sweat was now priceless. In England, the average wage for a farm worker doubled within a decade. A carpenter in Florence could demand 3 times his pre-plague pay. For the first time in history, laborers had leverage, and they used it. Manuscripts from the era show peasants abandoning estates that refused higher wages, flocking to towns where desperate landowners offered bonuses like free housing or even plots of land. The feudal contract, once unbreakable, was now written in gold. Lords fought back with brutal force. The English crown passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, freezing wages at pre-plague levels and punishing anyone who dared ask for more. Records from Essex tell of a blacksmith jailed for charging excessive rates, while a group of German nobles famously burned down a village whose tenants demanded fair pay. But the laws were impossible to enforce. With entire regions depopulated, workers simply packed up and left, knowing another lord would gladly pay their price. The old order wasn't just cracking, it was shattering, and then came the revolts. Fueled by newfound bargaining power and centuries of pent-up rage, peasants across Europe rose up in armed rebellion. The Jacquerie in France saw serfs torching noble manors, while England's peasants' revolt of 1381 brought rebel armies to the gates of London. Though these uprisings were crushed, their message was clear. The myth of noble superiority had died with the plague victims. A chronicler in Ghent summed it up perfectly, writing, "God is punishing the pride of the great by making the lowly untouchable." The economic shockwaves reached far beyond the fields. With fewer workers, Europe pivoted from labor-intensive grain farming to pastoral agriculture. Sheep and cattle required fewer hands. This shift birthed the wool trade that would later fuel the Renaissance economy. Meanwhile, the sheer cost of burying the dead and supporting orphans bankrupted monasteries and noble houses alike, transferring wealth to a new class of merchants and skilled artisans. The plague didn't just change who worked, it changed who owned, who ruled, and ultimately who mattered. What makes this transformation so startling isn't just its speed, but its permanence. The Black Death didn't just thin the population, it rewired society's DNA. The rise of a money economy, the decline of serfdom, even the seeds of early capitalism all trace back to those desperate years when death turned the world upside down. Feudalism didn't fall to swords or laws, it was suffocated by the silent arithmetic of empty villages and the audacity of survivors who dared to ask, "What am I really worth?" Fear makes monsters out of shadows, and in the terror-struck years of the Black Death, Europe's desperation birthed a frenzy of persecution unlike anything seen before. When reason failed to explain why God would allow such suffering, people turned on each other, pointing fingers at anyone deemed different, sinful, or unholy. At the top of that list were the Jews. Rumors spread like wildfire. They were poisoning wells, cursing Christian children, conspiring with the devil to wipe out Christendom. Never mind that Jewish communities were dying too, gripped by the same agonies as their neighbors. In Basel, Strasbourg, and Mainz, mobs dragged entire families from their homes, burning them alive in makeshift pyres. A chronicler in Cologne described the streets running red not with plague blood, but with the blood of innocents massacred by neighbors who'd once broken bread with them. Lepers became targets next. Already ostracized for their disfiguring disease, they were now accused of spreading corruption by smearing their sores on church doors or market stalls. In France, leper colonies were raised by torch-bearing villagers, their inhabitants slaughtered without trial. Then came the witches, midwives, herbalists, eccentric old women, anyone whose knowledge of healing seemed suspicious. A single accusation could mean death. In Bern, 8 women were drowned in a single day after a child claimed they'd cursed his village with black fog. The madness had no logic, only hunger for anyone to blame. But the most chilling spectacle wasn't the violence against outsiders, it was the violence turned inward. Enter the Flagellants, a fanatical movement that swept across Germany and the Low Countries. Clad in ragged robes marked with red crosses, these processions of hundreds, sometimes thousands, marched from town to town, whipping their own backs with iron-tipped scourges until the flesh hung in ribbons. They believed the plague was God's wrath for humanity's sins, and only extreme penance could save them. Witnesses described the eerie chants, the metallic scent of blood in the air, the way they'd collapse in the mud, gasping prayers through broken teeth. Here's the cruel twist: these acts of devotion may have spread the plague faster. Flagellants traveled constantly, their open wounds dripping into crowded town squares. Fleas thrived in their blood-stained garments, hopping from their ragged hems to new victims. In Erfurt, a single group of flagellants triggered an outbreak that killed 2,000 within weeks. The church, initially sympathetic, soon condemned the movement, not just for its frenzy, but because it undermined clerical authority. When flagellants began claiming their blood held miraculous healing powers, even offering vials of it for sale, the Pope declared them heretics. By then, the damage was done. What makes this chapter so haunting isn't just the brutality, it's the pattern. Whether targeting Jews, lepers, or their own bodies, people weren't just fighting the plague. They were fighting the unbearable terror of randomness, the need to believe suffering had meaning. If the devil had a hand in it, or if it was punishment for sin, then at least the world still made sense. The real horror, sometimes tragedy, is just tragedy, a blind, indifferent force that doesn't care who prays or persecutes, and that truth was harder to face than any whip or pyre. Amidst the devastation of the Black Death, art became a mirror for Europe's shattered soul, nowhere more vividly than in the Danse Macabre, the dance of death. Picture this: frescoes lining church walls, their colors faded but their message timeless. Skeletons in grotesque grins clutch the hands of kings and peasants alike, pulling them into a whirling procession toward the grave. A pope resplendent in robes trips over his own crozier as a bony figure whispers in his ear. A child, barely tall enough to reach death's waist, is led away mid-laugh. This was no morbid fantasy, it was the blunt truth hammered into Europe's consciousness. The plague had made one thing undeniable: death played no favorites. The earliest known Danse Macabre appeared in Paris's Holy Innocents Cemetery around 1424, a stark mural on the walls of a charnel house. But its roots dug deeper into the mass graves and empty streets of the previous century. Artists, many who'd buried their own families, translated the chaos into allegory. In Basel's famous mural, a skeletal fiddler plays a tune while a knight drops his sword mid-stride, his armor useless against the invisible enemy. The details mock human vanity. A merchant's purse spills coins as death tugs his sleeve, a baker's loaf crumbles untouched. These weren't just warnings about mortality, they were subversive satire leveling society's hierarchies with gallows humor. Literature echoed the theme. Poems like The Dance of Death from the Lübeck manuscript personified death as a chatty companion, cracking jokes as he escorted his victims. "Come along, doctor," one verse taunts, "all your potions couldn't save your own wife." Even music fell under its spell. Chanting monks composed Dies Irae, its lyrics picturing Judgment Day as a Danse Macabre set to Sommer plainsong. The message was relentless: your wealth, your title, your piety, none of it mattered when the music stopped. What makes these works so haunting isn't just their darkness, but their defiance. By depicting death as an equal opportunity gesture, artists robbed it of some terror. If the plague could snatch a duke as easily as a beggar, then perhaps God wasn't punishing sinners, perhaps death was just part of the dance. And in that realization lay a fragile comfort. Everyone joined the circle eventually, so you might as well keep dancing while you could. The Danse Macabre didn't just mourn lost lives, it celebrated the ones still moving, however unsteadily, toward an uncertain future. In the midst of villages reduced to ghost towns, a handful of communities stood untouched, places where death's shadow seemed to hesitate. Take the village of Iam in England, where nearly 80% perished, yet the entire Hancock family survived unscathed. Or the bizarre case of Milan, where strict quarantine measures spared half its population while neighboring cities burned. But perhaps the most puzzling immunity belonged to a small cluster of families in a remote Welsh valley, 11 households where not a single soul fell ill, despite being surrounded by corpses. For centuries, these survivors were chalked up to luck or divine favor. Now, science is revealing a far more astonishing truth. Their descendants carry a genetic mutation that once saved their ancestors and might safeguard humanity's future. The key lies in a tiny quirk of DNA known as CCR5 delta 32. This mutation, found in roughly 1 in 10 Europeans today, alters a receptor on white blood cells that the plague bacterium exploited like a lockpick. Researchers studying bones from mass graves made a chilling discovery. Skeletons of survivors were disproportionately more likely to carry variants of this gene. It's as if the Black Death was a brutal filter, reshaping the human genome by killing those without this biological armor. The eerie part, that same mutation now protects against HIV, blocking the virus from hijacking immune cells in nearly identical fashion. Modern pandemics, it seems, are playing out an ancient battle written in our blood. One remarkable case traces back to a 14th century farmer named Oskar Gunnarsson in rural Sweden. Church records show he buried 3 wives and all his children during outbreaks, yet lived to remarry at 70. Genetic testing of his living descendants revealed an unusually pure lineage of CCR5 delta 32 carriers, some of whom participated in early HIV-resistant studies without realizing why their bodies fought the virus so effectively. Similar stories emerge from the French Alps, where isolated villages like Saint-Julien-en-Beauchamp maintained near-zero plague deaths. Today, their descendants show the highest concentration of the mutation in Europe, living proof that immunity can echo through centuries. But immunity wasn't just genetic, sometimes it was geographic. The island of Barøy off Norway's coast avoided the plague entirely thanks to its fishing-based diet and seaweed-lined walls that repelled fleas. In Poland, salt mining towns like Wieliczka stayed healthy, their underground tunnels laced with sodium crystals that dehydrated bacteria. Even stranger was the case of the Roma communities in Transylvania, whose nomadic lifestyle and strict taboos against handling the dead inadvertently kept them safer than their settled neighbors. Survival, it turns out, wasn't just about biology. It was about behavior, environment, and sometimes sheer stubbornness. What makes these stories more than historical curiosities is their modern relevance. Scientists now study plague survivors' DNA to hunt for other protective mutations, clues that could help combat everything from antibiotic-resistant bacteria to autoimmune diseases. The Black Death's legacy isn't just death, it's the invisible hand that sculpted our immune systems, leaving behind weapons we're still learning to wield. Those medieval families who stared down annihilation didn't just endure, they passed on a silent rebellion, encoded in double helixes, waiting for the next great battle between humanity and the microscopic fates. Long before humans collapsed in fevered agony, the animals knew. Chronicles from 1347 describe eerie scenes, farm dogs howling at empty skies, flocks of birds falling dead mid-flight, cattle dropping in their tracks with blood-flecked foam at their muzzles. In one French village, every cat vanished within days, their bodies later found piled in alleys, stiff with rigor mortis. these weren't omens. They were the first victims of a catastrophe rewriting the rules of life itself. Recent excavations of medieval trash pits tell a chilling story. Layers of bones reveal a pattern: first rodents, then domestic animals, then humans. In London's East Smithfield Cemetery, archaeologists unearthed horse skeletons beneath mass graves, their ribcage showing lesions identical to human plague victims. But here's the twist: some were buried weeks before the human toll spiked. Similar finds in Norway showed reindeer herds dying en masse, their migration routes becoming highways for fleas carrying death southward. The plague wasn't just infecting animals, it was using them as stepping stones. The debate over patient zero boils down to two gruesome candidates. On one side, black rats, their flea-infested bodies stowed in grain carts and ships' holds. Medieval port records from Marseille note a surge in rat carcasses washing ashore months before the first human cases. Yet skeptics point to Mongolia's marmots, stocky, prairie dog-like rodents whose pelts were prized in European markets. Trappers reportedly fell ill after skinning them, their hands riddled with sores. A 14th-century Persian doctor even warned against handling the striped beast of the steppes, describing symptoms eerily like septicemic plague. But livestock may hold the darkest clue. When historians analyzed monastery ledgers from Austria, they found something peculiar. Parish after parish reported dying sheep and goats before any human infections. One abbot's diary describes ewes bleeding at the eyes weeks prior to his own monks collapsing. Modern experiments support this. When scientists exposed goats to Yersinia pestis, the bacteria thrived in their blood without killing them immediately, turning the animals into mobile reservoirs. Imagine a shepherd tending his flock, unaware their warm fleeces hid fleas primed to jump ship at the first touch of human skin. Then there's the wildlife factor. Tree ring data from Scandinavia shows a bizarre squirrel population crash 2 years before the plague reached Norway. These weren't urban pests but forest dwellers, proof the disease burned through wild ecosystems first. Similar die-offs struck hedgehogs in England and hares in Russia, creating invisible bridges of infection between wilderness and towns, the nightmare scenario. The Black Death wasn't one outbreak but dozens, simmering in animal populations for years before the perfect storm of weather, trade, and starvation let it explode. What makes this more than historical forensics is the warning it carries. Every modern pandemic, from swine flu to bird flu, follows the same playbook: animals first, humans next. Medieval people didn't have the science to connect the dots between dying livestock and their own suffering. But as we watch viruses leap from bats to pangolins to humans today, their experience holds a grim lesson. When the animals start falling, it's never just their tragedy. It's the first chapter of ours. The year 1345 wasn't just the calm before the storm, it was a slow unraveling. Europe's climate had turned traitor. Winters dragged on, spring rains refused to stop, and summer sun withered crops before they could ripen. Chroniclers wrote of rivers freezing so solid that carts could cross them in June, then flooding so violently they swallowed entire villages by August. This wasn't just bad weather. It was the dawn of the Little Ice Age, a climatic shift that set the stage for history's deadliest act. And when the Black Death finally arrived, it didn't meet a thriving civilization. It found a society already on its knees. Tree rings from ancient oaks tell the grim story. Between 1330 and 1350, Europe endured the coldest, wettest decades in centuries. Grain yields plummeted by half in England, while French vineyards produced wine so sour it was undrinkable. In Scandinavia, failed harvests led to bread made from bark and ground animal bones. But the real killer wasn't hunger itself, it was what starvation did to the body. Malnutrition shreds the immune system, leaving victims vulnerable to infections that would normally be shrugged off. Skeletal remains from mass graves show shocking rates of anemia and bone lesions, proof that millions were already walking corpses when the plague struck. The connection between climate and plague goes deeper than weakened bodies. Unusually wet summers created a flea paradise: damp straw in barns, moldy grain stores, and waterlogged streets teeming with rodents. A single warm winter could send flea populations exploding tenfold. And when desperate peasants began eating their seed grain and slaughtering plow animals, they didn't just starve next year, they destroyed the ecological barriers that kept rats out of homes. No grain stores meant rodents invaded living spaces, bringing their deadly passengers with them. Some of the worst-hit regions reveal this lethal synergy. Tuscany's fertile valleys, normally lush with wheat and olives, became swamps in the 1340s. Contemporary accounts describe villagers with swollen bellies from famine suddenly covered in buboes, their bodies too exhausted to mount a defense. In Norway, where fishing villages usually escaped crop failures, record cold pushed herring stocks northward, collapsing the local economy just as plague ships docked. Even the wealthy couldn't buy immunity. Venetian merchants who survived on imported Egyptian grain found their lifeline cut when the Nile failed to flood, triggering panicked riots before the first plague death was even recorded. But here's the twist: climate may have also forged the plague's escape route from its Central Asian cradle. Ice cores from the Tian Shan Mountains show massive glacial melts in the early 14th century, flooding rodent burrows and driving disease-carrying marmots into human settlements. The same weather patterns that crippled Europe likely supercharged the outbreak at its source, creating a perfect storm of desperation and displacement. Nomads fleeing drought-stricken steppes, traders pushing into new territories as old routes collapsed, even the Mongol armies whose sieges allegedly spread plague, all were responding to a climate system gone haywire. What makes this more than historical trivia is the pattern it reveals. Pandemics don't happen in a vacuum, they exploit fractures already present in society. The Black Death wasn't just a microbial disaster, it was the climax of an ecological, economic, and climatic cascade, and that's the unsettling echo for our own era. As modern glaciers retreat and weather grows more erratic, we're left to wonder what invisible threats might be stirring in the thaw. Beneath London's bustling financial district lies a silent testament to the Black Death's horror: the East Smithfield Plague Pits. Unearthed during construction work in the 1980s, these mass graves hold over 700 skeletons, stacked 5 deep in trenches carved with desperate urgency. What makes East Smithfield so extraordinary isn't just the scale of burial, but the forensic secrets locked in those bones. When scientists extracted DNA from the teeth of victims, they hit pay dirt, strands of Yersinia pestis preserved for 7 centuries in the pulp cavities. It was the smoking gun confirming the bacterium behind history's deadliest pandemic. But the story didn't end there. The real mystery emerged when researchers compared these ancient strains to modern plague samples. Some East Smithfield victims carried a genetic variant unlike anything seen today, a missing link between the medieval plague and its descendants. One particular skeleton, dubbed B7, yielded a strain with mutations that made it hyper-aggressive, possibly explaining why some outbreaks burned faster than others. Yet other pits, like those in Barcelona, held strains nearly identical to modern ones, suggesting the Black Death wasn't a single unified wave, but a patchwork of genetically distinct outbreaks weaving through Europe. Then there's the puzzle of the lucky graves. In Saint Laurent de la Cabreuse, France, archaeologists found a pit where skeletons showed no trace of Yersinia pestis, yet they bore the same trauma marks and burial patterns as confirmed plague victims. Were they misdiagnosed, or did some die from secondary disasters, starvation, violence, or other diseases unleashed by societal collapse? The answer might lie in their isotopes. Chemical signatures in their bones revealed diets rich in millet, a famine food, hinting at a population already pushed to the brink when plague arrived. But the most haunting clues come from how these bodies were treated. At East Smithfield, skeletons were laid with arms crossed, some even clutching makeshift crosses of twine, evidence of caregivers risking infection to offer dignity in death. Contrast that with the ghastly plague pit of Marseille, where bodies were dumped mid-decomposition, limbs twisted in rigor mortis. The difference: Marseille's grave dates to the pandemic's peak, when the living were too outnumbered to bury properly, while East Smithfield reflects London's organized response under King Edward III, who designated emergency cemeteries to prevent panic. What makes these graves more than archaeological curiosities is their modern relevance. When scientists recreated the East Smithfield strain's proteins, they discovered it shared chilling similarities with antibiotic-resistant bacteria today. The Black Death's DNA isn't just history, it's a living laboratory teaching us how pathogens evolve under pressure. And perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of these pits: pandemics don't just kill. They bury secrets in the bones of the fallen, waiting for future generations to dig them up. While the Black Death turned Europe into a graveyard, a handful of regions stood like islands in the storm, miraculously untouched or suffering far lighter blows. Poland's mysterious resilience has baffled historians for centuries. Despite bordering devastated regions like Prussia and Bohemia, Polish death tolls remained shockingly low. Some credit the kingdom's decentralized villages, where sparse populations and vast forests created natural firebreaks against contagion. Unlike crowded Italian cities where neighbors breathed down each other's necks, Polish farmsteads kept families isolated, with grain stored in elevated granaries that discouraged rats. Even their architectural quirks helped. Thatched roofs, common elsewhere, were rare here, eliminating cozy nesting grounds for fleas. Then there's Milan, where a ruthless leader named Archbishop Giovanni Visconti ordered something radical, walling up plague-stricken households alive. Doors were bricked over, windows sealed, leaving the infected to perish inside a brutal but effective quarantine. Contemporary accounts describe guards patrolling with torches, ready to burn any house where coughing was heard. The policy sparked outrage, but the numbers spoke for themselves. Milan's mortality rate was half that of Florence or Venice. Their secret: early and extreme isolation, cutting chains of transmission before they could spiral. Geography played savior for others. Norway's remote fishing villages, accessible only by treacherous fjords, saw ships turn away at the first rumor of illness. In the Basque Country, mountain passes iced over early that year, sealing off communities before carriers could arrive. Even wind patterns may have spared parts of Belgium. Researchers found that prevailing breezes blew smoke from mass funeral pyres away from living quarters, reducing airborne exposure. But pure luck shouldn't be discounted. The village of Iam in England famously quarantined itself, yet some families survived untouched while neighbors died. Was it genetics, immunity, or simply chance that their homes had fewer flea-infested floor rushes? Modern epidemiologists point to superspreader events. A single packed market or church service could doom a town, while those avoiding such gatherings slipped through the cracks. The real lesson of these safe havens isn't just historical curiosity, it's a masterclass in pandemic defense. Distance, barriers, and swift action saved lives 700 years ago. And as we face our own global health crises, that ancient wisdom echoes louder than ever. Survival isn't about magic cures, but about breaking the chain before it breaks you. The Silk Road might have carried the plague westward, but it was Europe's bustling ports that turned the Black Death into a continental wildfire. Picture a 14th century harbor, creaking wooden ships packed with grain sacks, their hulls crawling with black rats, their crews unknowingly carrying fleas in the folds of their woolen cloaks. These vessels became floating death traps, their cargo holds perfect breeding grounds for infected fleas. And just like modern airports, medieval ports were the ultimate superspreaders, chaotic, crowded, and connected to everywhere. Take the Sicilian port of Messina, where the plague first landed in Europe in 1347. A Genoese trading galley limped into harbor, its crew already dying mid-voyage. Panicked locals forced the ship back to sea, but it was too late. Fleas had already jumped to dockworkers who carried them into the city's grain warehouses. Within weeks, Messina's death toll soared so high that bodies were dumped into the harbor, contaminating the water and ensuring every ship that stopped there sailed away with more than just spices. The same horror repeated in Marseille, where a single merchant vessel from the Levant unleashed an outbreak that killed half the city. Ports weren't just points of entry, they were amplifiers, taking a spark and turning it into an inferno. Grain shipments played a particularly sinister role. Unlike luxury goods transported in sealed chests, grain was loose, piled high in holds where rats could burrow undetected. Records from Venice show entire shiploads of wheat arriving with dead rats tangled in the stalks, discarded like rotten fruit once the cargo was unloaded. But the real danger came from how grain was stored ashore. Municipal granaries were often dark, damp, and infested, creating reservoirs of infection that kept fleas thriving long after the ships had sailed. In Constantinople, inspectors reported grain sacks moving on their own from the squirming mass of rodents inside. The parallels to modern travel hubs are chilling. Medieval ports functioned like today's international airports, hubs where people and pathogens from across the globe collided. A merchant from Cairo could board a ship in Alexandria, transfer in Rhodes, and dine in Naples within weeks, his luggage carrying stowaways far deadlier than any contraband. Sound familiar? The same pattern plays out with pandemic flu strains emerging from crowded Asian wet markets or Ebola spreading through West African transit routes. History's greatest lesson might be this: no matter the century, the most dangerous thing we ever built wasn't weapons, it was networks, yet some ports defied the odds. Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, imposed the world's first maritime quarantine in 1377, forcing ships to anchor offshore for 40 days, a waiting period called quarantino that we still reference today. Their secret, recognizing that plague wasn't just carried by people, but by the very infrastructure of trade itself. When we watch cruise ships turned away from ports during viral outbreaks or airports screening travelers for fevers, we're replaying a 700-year-old battle, one where the real enemy was never the ships, but our own insatiable hunger to connect. The Black Death wasn't a single nightmare, it was a recurring horror. Just when Europe began to rebuild, the plague returned with a vengeance in the 1360s, then again in the 1370s, each wave carving fresh scars into a society still bleeding from the first strike. But something strange happened. These later outbreaks killed far fewer people. If the first wave was a scythe cutting down nearly half the population, the second and third were sharpened knives, deadly but not indiscriminate. The reason? A twisted dance between biology and human adaptation. Take the outbreak of 1361, known as the Pestis Secunda. Contemporary accounts describe towns bracing for another apocalypse, only to find death's grip had loosened. In Florence, where 60,000 perished in 1348, the second wave claimed just 12,000. London's mortality dropped by 2/3. Part of this was grim arithmetic. The first wave had already culled the most vulnerable, leaving behind survivors with hardened resistance. Modern genetic studies back this up. Skeletons from post-plague graves show higher frequencies of the CCR5 Delta 30-2 mutation, proof that natural selection was sculpting a more resistant population. But biology wasn't the only shield. Humans learned. After watching entire cities collapse, survivors developed brutal but effective countermeasures. Venice pioneered the world's first quarantine system, forcing ships to anchor offshore for 40 days, a waiting period called quarantino that gave the disease time to burn out. Milan's rulers enforced street cleaners to remove waste where rats bred, while doctors in Paris abandoned bloodletting in favor of isolating the sick. Even fashion played a role. The wealthy began wearing tight-fitting clothes and gloves, unwittingly reducing flea bites. These weren't just precautions, they were the birth of public health. Yet the darkest twist lay in the plague's own biology. The later strains seemed less vicious, possibly because killing all your host is a poor survival strategy for a pathogen. Records from the 1374 outbreak describe slower progression, with victims lasting weeks instead of days, a sign the bacteria had traded raw lethality for better transmission. Like a predator thinning its own herd, the plague had evolved to keep its prey alive long enough to spread. The lesson of these waves isn't just about medieval suffering, it's a blueprint for how pandemics end. Immunity, adaptation, and the sheer randomness of evolution all play their parts, and as we face our own recurring threats, from seasonal flu to resurgent COVID variants, the Black Death whispers a warning: the first strike is never the last. The real test is whether we learn fast enough to survive what comes next. Imagine doctors walking through plague-stricken streets holding bouquets of flowers to their noses, convinced the disease floated on the very air they breathe. This was the heart of miasma theory, the centuries-old belief that foul odors caused illness, a misconception that shaped medieval medicine and tragically hindered real progress against the Black Death. The logic seemed simple: where there was sickness, there was stench, rotting corpses, overflowing latrines, the acrid smoke of burning plague victims. All smelled terrible, so surely the bad air itself carried death. Physicians even crafted elaborate nosegays filled with lavender and cloves, certain these sweet scents could purify corrupted lungs. But miasma theory wasn't just wrong, it was dangerously distracting. By focusing on smells rather than vectors like fleas or bacteria, healers ignored the true mechanisms of transmission. Take the case of London's infamous Great Stink of 1358, when officials ordered streets scrubbed with vinegar and lime to neutralize odors. The effort did nothing to stop the plague, but the scrubbing brushes may have disturbed flea-infested debris, inadvertently spreading infected insects further. Even the iconic plague doctor masks, with their long beaks stuffed with aromatic herbs, were designed to filter poisoned air, a futile gesture when the real threat lurked in the fleas clinging to their robes. The roots of this delusion ran deep. Ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates had taught that disease sprang from imbalances in humors and corrupted atmospheres. By the Middle Ages, this idea hardened into dogma, reinforced by observation. Areas with poor sanitation did smell worse, and people there did get sick more often. But correlation isn't causation, and the miasma mindset blinded Europe to obvious clues. When a physician in Vienna noted that plague often struck households with new woolen carpets, ideal habitats for fleas, his peers dismissed him, insisting the carpets merely trapped bad air. What makes this myth so tragic is how long it persisted. Long after the Black Death faded, miasma theory stalled medical progress. Florence Nightingale herself, the pioneer of modern nursing, still blamed cholera outbreaks on foul odors in the 1800s. It wasn't until germ theory emerged in the late 19th century that science finally abandoned the aromatic fallacy. Yet remnants linger today in our cultural reflexes. Think of the instinct to open windows during illness, or the persistent stigma around dirty neighborhoods. The cruel irony: medieval people weren't entirely misguided about cleanliness. Their sewer digging and corpse burning did reduce flea habitats, but for the wrong reasons. Had they understood why these measures worked, they might have targeted rats and insects directly, saving countless lives. Instead, miasma theory became an intellectual straitjacket, a cautionary tale of how even the most intuitive beliefs can lead us astray when we mistake symptoms for causes. The next time you catch yourself blaming a bad smell for your headache, remember, sometimes the stench isn't the sickness, it's just the shadow of something far deadlier hiding in plain sight. When the Black Death swept through Europe, it didn't just kill millions, it shattered 1,000 years of unshakable faith. Before the plague, the Church stood as the ultimate authority, its promises of divine protection and salvation accepted without question. But as priests dropped dead alongside their congregations, as desperate prayers went unanswered, and as the very people claiming to speak for God fled their posts, something irreversible happened. The survivors started doubting. This wasn't just a crisis of mortality, it was the first crack in the foundation of medieval thought, the moment Europe began trading unquestioning piety for the skepticism that would ignite the Renaissance. Consider the chilling account of the Bishop of Bath and Wells in England. In 1348, he issued a desperate decree: any priest abandoning their flock during the plague would lose their salary. Why? Because so many clergy had already fled, leaving the dying without last rites or burials. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI had to consecrate the entire Rhone River just to have somewhere to dump the corpses, hardly the divine intervention people expected from Christ's vicar on earth. When even the holiest men couldn't explain why God would allow such suffering, ordinary people began looking elsewhere for answers. The shift wasn't subtle. Art from the post-plague period tells the story where once paintings showed saints bathed in celestial light. Now they depicted skeletons dragging popes and emperors into open graves. The Danse Macabre murals weren't just morbid entertainment, they were propaganda for a new idea. Death plays no favorites, so why should power? This leveling effect bled into society. Peasants who'd once bowed to nobility now saw lords buried in the same mass graves as beggars. The result, a population less willing to accept, because God wills it, as an answer to injustice. But the real revolution happened in the universities. Before the plague, scholars debated how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. Afterward, men like Petrarch and Boccaccio turned their focus to human experience, emotion, and reason. Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the plague's shadow, is telling. Its characters aren't saints or theologians, but merchants, lovers, and tricksters surviving through wit and resilience. This was humanism in its rawest form. If God won't save us, we'll save ourselves. The church fought back, of course. Flagellant movements sprang up, groups of fanatics whipping themselves bloody to atone for humanity's sins. Inquisition records show a spike in trials for heresy as authorities tried to stamp out doubt. But the genie was out of the bottle. When the plague returned in later waves, cities like Venice responded not with prayer processions, but with quarantine laws and sanitation crews, the seeds of secular governance. What makes this shift so extraordinary is how quickly it unfolded. Within a single generation, Europe went from building cathedrals to questioning whether the men inside them had any real connection to the divine. The Renaissance didn't emerge from a vacuum. It was born from the ashes of a world where faith had failed, and humanity had to learn to trust itself. And in that shift lies the Black Death's most enduring legacy, not just a change in how people died, but in how they dared to live. The flames that consumed the great library of the Medical School of Paris in 1349 didn't just burn parchment and ink, they devoured centuries of accumulated wisdom. Among the ashes were Arabic medical texts painstakingly translated into Latin, anatomical sketches based on dissections now forbidden by the Church, and herbal compendiums listing remedies that might have eased the plague's suffering. This was no accident of war or riot. The books were deliberately torched by panicked citizens convinced the knowledge itself was cursed. Similar scenes played out across Europe. In Montpellier, students burned their own professors' manuscripts, while in Oxford, mobs ransacked the university's collections searching for heretical texts they blamed for attracting God's wrath. The tragedy wasn't just the loss of books, but the silencing of the minds that understood them. Consider the case of Gentile de Foligno, a renowned physician whose detailed plague treatise was one of the last works of medieval medicine to blend Arabic scholarship with emerging empirical observation. When he succumbed to the very disease he studied, his unpublished manuscripts were either burned as dangerous or left to rot in abandoned workshops. His death marked the extinction of an entire school of thought, one that might have bridged the gap between ancient theories and the scientific method. Entire fields regressed overnight. Alchemy lost its most rigorous practitioners, astronomy its keenest star mappers, and botany its most meticulous herbalists. The plague didn't just kill people, it murdered potential, severing intellectual lineages that would take generations to rebuild. the void left by dead scholars altered the course of science itself. Before the plague, Oxford's Merton College was pioneering mathematical physics, with scholars like Thomas Bradwardine making breakthroughs in kinematics. His surviving peers abandoned such frivolous pursuits post-plague, turning instead to theology and penitential writings. At the University of Bologna, where legal scholars had been compiling the first systematic studies of anatomy, the sudden death of faculty led to a century-long reversion to Gaelic dogma. Even practical knowledge vanished. Manuals on well digging and water purification, critical for public health, were tossed into bonfires alongside witchcraft texts. Perhaps most heartbreaking were the works we'll never know were lost. The Cairo-based physician Ibn al-Khatib had written a revolutionary theory of contagion years before the plague, suggesting diseases spread through minute bodies transferred between people. His manuscripts reached Andalusia just in time for the Black Death to kill every scholar capable of translating them from Arabic. Meanwhile, in China, the Mongol-promoted medical compendium Hui Yao Fang, filled with plague treatments from Persian and Central Asian doctors, was abandoned mid-translation when imperial academies emptied. These weren't just books gathering dust, they were doors slamming shut on alternate futures where science might have taken different, faster paths. The greatest casualty wasn't the knowledge itself, but the culture that produced it. Pre-plague Europe had been slowly inching toward empirical inquiry, with dissection theaters opening in Italy and astronomers challenging Ptolemaic models. Afterward, the survivors, traumatized and distrustful of reason, retreated into mysticism. The Renaissance didn't spring fully formed from the ashes. It took another 100 years of slow, painful rediscovery. When we mourn the Library of Alexandria, we imagine a single catastrophic fire, but the Black Death was 1,000 smaller flames, each swallowing not just scrolls, but the living threads of curiosity that might have woven them into something greater. The plague's shadow lingers in every what-if of scientific history, in the cures undiscovered, the theories unproven, and the minds that never got to wonder at all. While Europe reeled from the Black Death, the plague was writing its horror across continents in vastly different scripts. In Cairo, where the Nile's pulse usually dictated life, the streets filled with corpses faster than they could be hauled away. Chroniclers describe pyramids of bodies so high they blocked the sun. The Mamluk Sultanate, caught between Mongol threats and internal strife, watched helplessly as the disease killed an estimated 1/3 of Egypt's population. But here's what's startling: their medical response outpaced Europe's by centuries. Arab physicians, building on Ibn Sina's centuries-old theories of contagion, advocated for isolation and burned contaminated clothing, while imams organized mass graves outside city walls to slow the spread. Compare that to Venice, where officials only established their first quarantine station decades later after the plague's worst waves had already passed. India's experience unraveled another thread of the story. Sanskrit texts from the Delhi Sultanate describe a fire in the blood that swept through port cities like Calicut and Cambay, killing so many that Hindu cremation grounds ran out of wood, forcing survivors to dump bodies in the Ganges. But unlike Europe's chaotic collapse, some Indian kingdoms adapted with eerie precision. The Vijayanagara Empire deployed teams of wind watchers, observers posted on hills to monitor which way smoke from funeral pyres blew, evacuating villages downwind before the plague could reach them. It was crude epidemiology, but it worked. Records show certain valleys in the Deccan Plateau had death rates half those of nearby regions. Then there's China, where the Yuan dynasty's collapse intersected catastrophically with the pandemic. Chinese doctors noted something European physicians missed. The plague often followed periods of flooding, hinting at a link between waterlogged land and outbreaks. While Mongol rulers dismissed these observations as peasant superstition, local magistrates in the Yangtze Delta took action, draining marshes, relocating rat-infested granaries, and even experimenting with early forms of face masks made from scented cloth. Their efforts couldn't stop the devastation, but they did something remarkable. They left behind detailed records of case numbers and transmission patterns, creating history's first systematic plague data sets. But perhaps the most striking contrast was in the Ottoman Empire, where the plague's later waves met an emerging system of kervansare karantinas, quarantine stations along trade routes. Travelers were held in stone compounds for 40 days with their goods, while inspectors burned any fabrics showing signs of flea infestations. This wasn't just bureaucracy, it was biological warfare. In Edirne, officials even tracked which caravans had passed through infected regions, enforcing staggered entry to prevent overcrowding. The system had gaps. Of course, nomadic tribes often evaded checkpoints, but its existence reveals a chilling truth. While Europe was still blaming miasma, some societies were already fighting pandemics with science. What binds these global stories isn't just shared suffering, but the unsettling ways cultures mirrored each other's solutions across continents. From Cairo's burn orders to Vijayanagara's wind watchers, humanity was grasping toward the same truths about contagion, just separated by language, luck, and centuries of lost knowledge. The real tragedy of the Black Death isn't that it killed millions, but that so many had to rediscover the wheel of survival over and over, never knowing how close others had come to stopping the nightmare. The Black Death never truly vanished, it merely retreated into the shadows, biding its time. Right now, as you watch this, cases of plague still surface from the American Southwest to the steppes of Mongolia. In 2024 alone, health officials confirmed outbreaks in Oregon, Colorado, and even affluent suburbs like Lake Tahoe, where a hiker contracted septicemic plague after disturbing a rodent nest. Over in Madagascar, where the plague is endemic, seasonal flare-ups now infect hundreds annually, with pneumonic strains spreading through crowded slums like wildfire. The bacteria hasn't weakened, it's adapted. Antibiotics should have relegated Yersinia pestis to history books, yet the plague stubbornly persists. Streptomycin and doxycycline remain frontline defenses, curing patients if administered within 24 hours of symptoms. But here's the catch, these lifelines are fraying. In Madagascar's 2017 outbreak, researchers identified strains resistant to multiple antibiotics, including the last resort drug gentamicin. These mutant bacteria didn't emerge in a lab. They evolved naturally, passing resistance genes through flea guts like dark currency. It's a chilling echo of medieval times when the plague outsmarted every remedy until it chose to recede. The real danger lies in the collision of ancient pathogen and modern folly. In Gansu Province, China, herders still skin marmots for fur, risking exposure to fleas carrying strains untouched by modern medicine. Arizona's prairie dog colonies, once controlled by pesticides, now thrive near suburban sprawl, their fleas hopping onto curious pets. Even climate change fuels the threat. Melting permafrost in Siberia has unearthed centuries-old plague graves, thawing bacteria that modern science hasn't tested against. Yet the greatest twist isn't the plague's survival, it's our complacency. When a New Mexico man died of plague in 2023, health investigators traced his infection to a single flea bite during a routine walk. No medieval filth, no rats in the streets, just an invisible thread connecting our world to the 14th century's nightmare. The difference now, we have the tools to fight back if we respect an enemy that's never really left us. Not everyone believes the Black Death was caused by Yersinia pestis. In the shadowy corners of historical debate, conspiracy theories whisper alternative explanations: anthrax outbreaks, viral hemorrhagic fevers, even cosmic radiation poisoning. Some fringe scholars point to medieval accounts describing victims bleeding from the eyes and vomiting black bile, symptoms reminiscent of Ebola rather than classic bubonic plague. Others highlight regions where mass graves show unusual bone discoloration, suggesting something more sinister than flea bites. Could history have mislabeled the deadliest pandemic of all time? The anthrax theory gained traction after researchers found traces of Bacillus anthracis in a few 14th century skeletons. Proponents argue that wartime conditions, corpses rotting in fields, livestock dying on mass, created perfect conditions for anthrax spores to spread. There's a haunting logic to it. Anthrax causes blackened skin lesions similar to septicemic plague, and unlike Yersinia, it can survive for centuries in soil. But here's the catch. Genetic studies of plague pits overwhelmingly identify Yersinia DNA, not anthrax. Even more damning, anthrax doesn't explode into pandemics. It's a localized killer, burning through a village livestock rather than racing across continents. Then there's the viral hypothesis. A handful of medieval texts describe symptoms eerily similar to hemorrhagic fevers, high fevers, internal bleeding, rapid organ failure. Some theorists speculate an ancient cousin of Ebola or Marburg virus hitchhiked along trade routes. The problem: viruses seldom leave traces in centuries-old bones. Until someone invents a time-traveling microscope, we're stuck with the evidence we have: Yersinia's genetic fingerprint in tooth pulp from London to Marseille. The wildest theory of all blames cosmic forces. A few fringe researchers cite tree ring data showing a spike in carbon-14 around 1348, hinting at possible solar flares or gamma-ray bursts. They argue radiation could have weakened immune systems globally, making ordinary diseases deadlier. It's a sci-fi twist, but mainstream scientists roll their eyes. The carbon spike aligns better with the Little Ice Age's climatic chaos, and there's zero physical evidence of mass radiation exposure in medieval skeletons. So why do these theories persist? Because the Black Death, like all great tragedies, invites mystery. Some discrepancies in the medieval record are real. Why did some victims die within hours while others lingered for weeks? Why did pneumonic symptoms dominate in certain outbreaks but not others? The answer isn't conspiracy, it's complexity. We now know Yersinia pestis isn't a single villain but a shapeshifter, with strains varying wildly in virulence. Some victims may have had concurrent infections like typhus or dysentery, muddying the symptom picture. And let's not forget malnutrition. Starving bodies fail in ways that baffle even modern doctors. The truth is, history rarely fits neat labels. The Black Death wasn't just one horror. It was a symphony of suffering playing out differently in every valley and village. What matters isn't whether we've named the monster perfectly, but whether we've learned its lessons. Because whether the next pandemic comes from a flea, a virus, or somewhere beyond our imagination, the outcome depends not on what we call it, but how we face it. 7 centuries apart, the same human instincts flare up in the face of invisible enemies. When COVID-19 swept the globe, we watched history rhyme in eerie ways, leaders downplaying threats until bodies piled up, marginalized groups scapegoated, and frantic crowds hoarding dubious cures like 14th century peasants clutching amulets of burnt sapphire. The parallels aren't just coincidental, they're baked into the psychology of panic. Take quarantine resistance. Venetian health boards in the 1300s faced violent riots when they tried sealing off plague houses, echoed almost verbatim in 2020 protests against lockdowns in Michigan and Berlin. Both eras saw people rage against containment, not because they doubted the danger, but because the cure felt like a slower, more visible form of death, loss of livelihood, autonomy, or dignity. Misinformation followed identical playbooks too. Medieval plague prophets peddled conspiracy theories about Jews poisoning wells, while modern influencers touted bleach injections and horse dewormer. The mechanisms had upgraded from town criers to TikTok, but the emotional fuel remained identical. Desperate people will grasp at any narrative that promises control over chaos. Even the backlash against experts mirrored the past. Physicians in beaked masks were mocked as quack scarecrows during the Black Death, just as false eye memes reduced complex epidemiology to online punching bags. Both societies punished messengers when their warnings became too inconvenient. Yet the most damning parallel lies in what we chose not to learn. After surviving the Black Death, Milan built Europe's first public health commission, a permanent body to monitor outbreaks. But once the terror faded, funding dried up, and the system crumbled until the next crisis. Sound familiar? The United States dismantled its pandemic response team in 2018, despite centuries of evidence that plagues always return. Likewise, medieval cities that survived by closing borders later abandoned quarantine laws to boost trade, just as nations rushed to reopen air travel post-COVID, prioritizing short-term economics over long-term vigilance. But here's where the comparison takes a darker turn. Our ancestors had excuses: no germ theory, no vaccines, no data networks to coordinate responses. What's ours? Medieval doctors blaming miasma didn't have electron microscopes revealing viruses in HD. Yet in 2020, with real-time global case maps at our fingertips, some leaders still acted like 14th century kings dismissing bad omens. When Black Death survivors finally rebuilt, they transformed medicine, governance, and labor rights. Our recovery: most countries still lack coordinated global surveillance for emerging pathogens. We've traded parchment for AI, but not the arrogance that makes us repeat history's blunders. The real plague isn't just the bacteria or the virus, it's the cyclical amnesia that lets us forget over and over until the next catastrophe reminds us. The Black Death wasn't just a disaster. It was a mirror reflecting humanity's fragility, ingenuity, and stubborn refusal to surrender. Across 7 centuries, we've peeled back layers of myth to uncover truths more unsettling than any medieval nightmare. The rats we blamed were just pawns in a game shaped by climate collapse, global trade, and genetic lottery. The feudal order that seemed unshakable crumbled under the weight of empty villages and empowered peasants. Even our victories were twisted survivors who carried life-saving mutations, may have unknowingly prolonged the plague's grip by walking among the doomed. Consider the sheer scale of what we've uncovered. A single strain of bacteria didn't just kill millions, it rewired economies, shattered religious dogma, and forced science to claw its way out of superstition's shadow. The same pandemic that inspired artists to paint grinning skeletons also birthed quarantines, labor rights, and the first inklings of public health. Every revelation, from the eerie immunity of Welsh valleys to the maritime quarantines of Ragusa, paints a picture not of mindless destruction, but of a world reshaped by desperate adaptation. Yet for all we've learned, the deepest mysteries remain. Why did some villages vanish while others thrived mere miles away? How many strains of Yersinia pestis still lie buried in unmarked graves, their genetic secrets lost to time? And what other forces, cosmic, viral, or utterly unknown, might have conspired with the plague to create such perfect devastation? History's greatest pandemics are never simple stories of germs and victims. They're tapestries woven from coincidence, folly, and resilience. So here's the question that haunts every discovery. If a flea-borne bacterium could topple empires and rewrite human DNA, what might a 21st century pandemic do? We've traded sailing ships for jetliners, miasma theory for genomic sequencing, but have we truly outgrown the cycles of denial and scapegoating that magnify every catastrophe? The next plague might not come from a rat's back. It could emerge from a thawing glacier, a lab leak, or a virus we've yet to name. But one lesson screams across the centuries: civilization is always one mutation away from chaos. The Black Death teaches us that survival isn't just about medicine, it's about memory. Will we remember the cost of ignoring warnings or repeat the same fatal shrugs? The choice is ours, and history, as always, is watching.